Welcome to our show, AdAstra With. Today, we have the great pleasure of connecting with Josh Giegel. Thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
For a great show spanning the transformation of new space industry, perspectives on leadership and career growth, team building, and the future of sustainability and where new space fits in, if at all.
All right, intro for Josh here. We got, you graduated from Penn State and then Stanford with degrees in mechanical engineering, and then spent 3.5 years at SpaceX as a propulsion engineer and analyst. We overlapped slightly, but I was an intern, and I don't think we interacted at all at the time, before doing a couple shorter stints at Virgin Galactic and a clean tech company. Josh then became a co-founder of Virgin Hyperloop, rising the ranks from VP of Design and Analysis all the way up to CTO and eventually CEO before moving on the end of 2021. Recently, Josh has been supporting many ventures behind the scenes. Focused.
Seriously.
Yeah, like many. We hear about from a bunch of random people. Oh, Josh is helping me with this.
He's the most incredible guy we've got helping on our team. Don't know how he produces so much.
Been focused largely in clean tech and defense. He's passionate about the power of engineering to create solutions that enable people to live their lives how they want, where they want, and in a way that is sustainable while preserving all that we hold dear. Man, love
There
that.
you go.
Did you come up with that on your own?
I did.
No,
Wow.
I did.
Impressive.
I moonlight as a marketing expert too, if you need any. So.
Everybody wants a piece of Josh.
Yeah.
That's great. A little brief introduction about Brian and I for people who don't know us yet. So I'm wildly passionate about people and thriving teams accomplishing massive goals, and I'm blessed to have my hands on this every day as a founder and CEO of AdAstra, through which we do headhunting for executive and highly technical professionals. Essentially, we find you the people you need to change the world.
Yeah, my background, aerospace engineering, got a couple degrees from Michigan in aerospace and worked at SpaceX for a while, spanning 7 years, mainly in propulsion, and just really am a aerospace nerd, if you will. And now I'm serving as COO, CTO of AdAstra. So that's a little bit about us, and dive into it here.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. So, Josh, you've touched new space from so many different perspectives, right? Like, really impressive education. I gotta get closer to the mic. All right.
Come on.
Really impressive education. And then specifically focusing on your time at SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, and now seeing many startups in new space due to your expertise in network. How do you see the culture of the industry changing?
I think one of the coolest things that's happened is when I first started at SpaceX, I'll never forget this. There was a guy I met at a bar. This was early 2009. And I told him, he worked for Northrop at the time. And he said, where do you work? And I told him I was working at a company called SpaceX. And he said, SpaceX? He thought it was some kind of like adult entertainment company. And what he said, like, I'll never forget. He goes, if there was a new space company, I would have heard about it. And that was like circa 2009. And now you've
7 years after SpaceX was founded.
7 years after SpaceX was founded, after they had already had like the first successful flight of Falcon 1.
Wow.
And yet here they were still like kind of a no name in the industry. And I remember that sticking with me pretty profoundly for the next like 10 years. And as you started to see more and more of these new space companies coming into play, there's a real interest of like the SpaceX effect, right? The people who've been there, they've watched something happen and they're going off and doing their own thing now. And I think back to my own journey, like I went to Stanford, like PhD, I'm going to go, do this incremental change in something somewhere.
Yep.
And I happened to get a former colleague at my time during NASA when I was interning. She recommended you should go check out this company, SpaceX. This was 2008, interviewed with like Elon right between Flight 3 and Flight 4 of Falcon 1.
Wow.
So right when it was like crunch time,
And,
right?
a lot of intensity or tension at the company at the time.
Intensity, tension, but the thing that like really stood out was there was this palpable buzz, like this just excitement amongst the team, looking for like other like really phenomenal people. And I remember going back to Stanford and telling my advisor at the time, like we were talking about doing quals, talking about what the PhD would look like, and I remember telling him, like, there's nothing I'd rather do less on this planet than what you just described.
Yeah.
And this company was like, this is going to be a company that was going to be like exciting to be a part of. And like, yeah, you got to work on rockets, and who as a kid with parents that were engineers wouldn't get excited about that? the thought of like working on that with like being the dumbest person in the room was like really exciting. And now you're seeing a lot of the people that I used to work with have their own companies all over the place. And now they're CEOs, they're CTOs, and from the nuclear industry to NewSpace to 3D printing to all these different companies. And I think it all came back to that buzz that was there, are just like really passionate, really excitable human beings that just love building stuff. And that's like how I'm like excitable about anything, and I just love building stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you seen the founder like ecosystem map for all the SpaceX and also Tesla? It's a really impressive.
Yeah. We were joking. There was during my time at SpaceX, I played in a band, and the people in that band, one is now the CEO of Radiant, a nuclear company. The other, he worked for me for a while, TJ, but they founded Freeform, which is a 3D printing company. One of the other guys, Jaden, he basically started a Revo. He was at Anduril with very early stages. And then the only other guy, Justin Richardson, has just been a CFD engineer for the last 15 years. So he always jokes with us. He goes, I'm the only one who didn't become a C of anything. But yeah, it's just like really cool to see that group and see like each of these like immensely talented individuals go off and do like awesome things for us, for the world, and like for themselves. So
yeah, and my tenure at SpaceX was about 5 years later, and now the same things is happening with the people I was working at SpaceX with at SpaceX, and it's just wild to see how quickly this is happening, where there's just a whole new generation of talent and entrepreneurs that are taking kind of the training we got at SpaceX, if you will, in the trenches to go do it on our own.
In a belief that, with like hard work, you can overcome anything. And I think like the hard work, the right team, and then finding something that you can just get excited to work on every single day. And I think the hard part, as you mentioned earlier, is like, I just excited about everything. So it's like hard, can get hard to focus at times, but it's good to see.
Yeah. It was a big part of why we started AdAstra is while at SpaceX, after leaving SpaceX, so many of our friends, we're seeing like new space companies pop up like once a week. And so many of those people were saying that they were like really needed help building teams. And we were like, this is something that we'd be able to help with. And so when we first started AdAstra, we were very specifically targeting NewSpace exclusively, only worked with NewSpace startups. And we realized quickly that we couldn't saturate the market because we have to have companies to take people from, right? And we're never going to take people from our current clients. And so we had to be very specific about which companies we would partner with. We were like, we should really branch out into an adjacent industry so we've got an additional talent pool to work with. And so at first we started with drones. We thought flight, right? Engineering, there's gonna be a lot of overlap. And we found very quickly that a lot of the people that we would interview to, hey, you've got transferable skills. Would you be interested in this really cool drone company? And they'd be like, it's kind of space or nothing. Actually, okay, it's not space or nothing, space or clean tech. And we heard that so many times. And that's an area that Brian and I are both very passionate about too. And so it just became very obvious that was the other industry that we would be branch into. So you are one of those people, right? that has like an incredible skill set that's useful in both of those arenas and it's of interest to you. Why do you think there's so much passion overlap in those two areas?
I think like a lot of it came from the fact that growing up, I grew up the son of two engineers. My wife's an engineer, my sister and my sister's husband are engineers. And there was this belief like the pinnacle of engineering was putting something into space, right? There's a reason why it's not rocket science as a phrase. And this thought of doing something of that caliber was exciting to me. It was like one of the reasons I had decided to become an engineer. So much so that when I got an offer to be like a co-op during undergrad, I decided to go. I actually met my wife interning at NASA Glenn in Cleveland. And NASA really taught me something, though, that was kind of fascinating, is that it taught me I didn't want to work at NASA. It just was slow. It was like yesteryear, right? There was all the reliance on things that had happened in the past, kind of that whatever it might be. And trying to find a new company in the space was like really hard at the time. But like now you start to see like, hey, we've kind of done it. Like, I mean, rockets used to only come up right? Or go up. Now
Yeah.
they come down in a controlled fashion, and where
Not
you
at
want them
first,
to come
but now
down,
they
right?
do.
Which is different than like how they used to be, and it's kind of like you feel like that beast has been slayed a little bit, right? And like now there's a whole ecosystem because that beast has been slayed, and this new idea of like climate, really, I think just even the last couple of years, it seemed like when COVID happened, you had this massive uptick of fires, and almost like it felt like this apocalyptic scenario, and people looking at like, all right, well, if we don't do something now, it's going to be too late. And what can we do now? What can we help with? And when you look at the skill sets that go into making a rocket go up, you really say like engineers are just people that are really good at solving problems, right? They might have a degree in mechanical, or they might have a degree in electrical, or whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, like they just learned how to solve problems and decompose them into ways that like are digestible. And I remember like the first time I watched my dad when I was like 12 years old fix something on a car, I just like visibly think like, this guy is the smartest guy in the world. Like, how did he know how to do this? And I'll never ever forget what he said. He goes, I didn't know how to fix it. I'm an engineer, so I work through the process. And I was like, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. And then like I think my fate was sealed from there.
Yeah.
It was like this is what I want to do. So
yeah. And what a better thing to apply that skill set of solving problems to say, saving our planet and expanding technology into the stars. Very cool. Okay, that's awesome. At Virgin Hyperloop, you had massive success and very quick promotion from VP to senior to from VP to senior VP to president of engineering to CTO to CEO. What do you think accounts for some of that incredible growth, and what advice do you have for others who want to grow kind of in that leadership path?
It's a great question. I think part of it is being at the right place at the right time. I think the other part is like being someone who's insatiably curious and really wants to learn about things, and people that for whatever reasons decide like, there was a lot of other people that were kind of in the same type of level, and then for whatever interpersonal skills or communication skills that I ended up acquiring, being able to move into more of a leader amongst that initial peer set, which at times is really challenging, right? And on the other hand is like you sort of get self-selected out of the group. But I really think at the end of the day, it came to how well can you communicate ideas? How well can you inspire the team? How well can you build the team? How well can you, be hard on them when they need to be hard, but also lift them up when they're down? And I think at times, like I did that really well, and at times I did that really poorly.
Yeah.
But I think with all the new ventures, like all the mistakes learned, like there's a lot of things when I look at new companies and I see them doing things, it's like, there's going to be a problem with X at some point in the future. And the thing that I find really fascinating is when you ask them about whatever that problem is, how do they take it? Are they defensive about it? Are they curious about it? Are they wanting to understand why you think it's a problem or not? And like the people that are on the curious side of the spectrum end up being the ones that you see solve that problem in the next 3 or 6 months, versus the other ones who are kind of in denial for a long period of time. And I will say, like, there was a lot of times I had people on my team that weren't performing to their expectations, and I wasn't fast enough to do something about it. And so like I lived through a lot of the like self-inflicted pain. And like having been on the other side now, like I'm kind of in a nice position where it's like I don't have to say yes to those type of relationships anymore. I can say like, hey, let's fix them together, or no, this just isn't for me.
Yeah.
Right. For whatever reason.
Yeah. A lot of the leadership skills that you talked about, both in communication and in, being able to interact and guide teammates to meeting their full potential or seeing what they need to do. Did that feel like a gift that you kind of always had, or maybe a starting gift that then you had to hone?
It was anything but that.
Okay.
I mean, like at SpaceX, being an analyst, like it was basically like sit in the corner and figure it out, right? We're not going to give you a ton of resources, but like you'll figure it out. And there was a lot of pride that came with that. And the idea of being at a launch company is really fascinating, because there's no better test for how good of an engineer you are when that rocket's going up in the air. If you're bad, it's coming down.
Yeah.
And there's like a real level of excitement with that, a real level of responsibility with that. But when I left and I went to this clean tech startup in Ohio, this was middle of 2012, I was kind of acting as like a mini CTO there. I was like leading the R&D group, and CTO had a number of other roles. And so I was starting to interface with external customers, clients, potential suppliers, and other things like that. And I remember I did a pitch, and not quite a pitch, but basically like what our company was, what technology we're building to a group. And the CEO, a guy named Phil, awesome human being, he watched me do this pitch and he pulled me aside afterwards and he goes, "Josh, I got to tell you something." I was like, "Oh boy." I know that yeah, buckle up. He goes, "You know, you might be the smartest person in whatever room you walk into, but what I saw today, you couldn't effectively communicate what it is we do to our customers." And he goes, "If you can't do that, you're no value to this company." And I thought that was like a really, like, he knew that would get a rise out of me. Like that might not work with other types of people.
Yeah.
But he then kind of challenged me. He said, unless you can explain whatever it is you do to anybody on the face of the earth, whether they're an engineer or not, in 5 seconds or in 5 minutes, you know, it's not really valuable. And I've seen a lot of people with phenomenal ideas who can't communicate them effectively. I've seen a lot of people with, you know, crappy ideas who can communicate them extremely well. And you just see like, wow, like it is the difference. And so you kind of go back to this, you know, almost like this like outliers philosophy. You need like 2,000 hours of practice for something to be good at it. And I look back at the moment of Hyperloop where I actually grabbed the chunk of that is for the first like 15 or 18 months, we had investors or customers, something like that, coming in like at least 4 or 5 times a week.
Wow.
And I was like the resident custodian at the library, like the librarian. I was giving them the tour. I was giving the whole thing. And so you got to do this practice, right? You got to do this practice of like explaining stuff to people. And there's a lot of times it was just awful. And then there were times you get little nuggets. And so by like 6 months in, you started to extract the good from the bad. And then you started to be able to read people, right? Like how are they responding to this? What's their background? How can I explain this in a way that they'll do it so that they're more engaged? And I thought that experience, you know, basically the feedback and the initial stuff at EchoGen in Ohio from my former CEO, Phil, leading into this opportunity to Hyperloop, which was like, go try it in practice and you're going to be bad. And I'll still have like some really terrible analogies or some where I'll just watch some of my team just no, Josh, just please no. But that experience I think was really helpful to cultivate a better understanding of how to communicate effectively.
Wow.
Storytelling is
Exactly.
so important, especially for founders
and
a lot of engineers. That is not a primary skill set, if you will.
Yeah. Wow. This, you know, a goal of what we're doing with this show is we want to give people actionable information that can help them further their lives and their careers. And I just want to have like the audience, people listening, like pause, go back, listen to that again. It was really, really powerful. Yeah. Like talking about communication in terms of not only like understanding the goals and motivations of the people that you're speaking to, but one of the things that you said that I just really want to highlight is as you're communicating to them, ensuring what is the platform from which they are listening. Can they understand what I'm talking about? Are they picking? Are they tracking? Are they able to track what I'm saying so that I can get my point across? That was really big. That was awesome.
And I think like when I've since leaving Hyperloop, doing a lot of stuff with a couple venture capital firms, watching what goes on after the founder leaves the room, right? Especially for seed or Series A pitches, has been eye-opening. Right? To watch what they focus in on. And I can tell you like the majority of times they're not talking about the idea. They're talking about the market. They're talking about the person. Is this person able to lead a team? Can they build a team? Will they be able to stick it out when things get hard? Are they going to be able to figure it out because this might not be it?
Yes.
Right? Are they going to be able to pivot and do that? And like, it basically, is this the person who can be the face of the company and communicate to the board, to external stakeholders, to employees, all of that like embodied passion, excitement, but also the realism that comes with taking other people's hard-earned money and trying to grow it into bigger dollar bills.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah,
so good.
Really powerful. We had an organization reach out to ask for our services, our headhunting support, and we asked for a conversation with the CEO and CTO, and we had that conversation, and both found that their talent strategy left a ton to be desired and seemed to be very disconnected from reality, which is an area that we can help, right?
Yep.
If they are interested in that advising and can kind of open their minds for that. But we found it incredibly difficult for them to communicate their idea, and we said, wish you the best of luck. We're not going to be a great partner for you, and separated. And it was really interesting to have their venture capital firm came back to us. One of the people on their team and said, "Can you give us more insight into what happened there?" And that, like, I could almost just say exactly what you just said. We were like, we do not see the strength of these leaders to be able to pivot where they need to pivot, and that they are looking at the journey that they're on in reality, and that I think that's you're gonna have a really hard time building a team of excellent people, because they are all going to pick up on that as well.
Yeah, and I think, like, what I've been really impressed working with you two on is that you're focused on some of the things we didn't focus on at the beginning of Hyperloop when it comes to hiring talent, right? Like, I was a pretty good judge of technical talent. I didn't focus on the cultural fit, right? And I think, especially at the beginning, when each person you have, when you're at a 10-person team, each person you have is going to have at least a 10% impact on culture. Some might have a little bit more. Some might have less. But, like, at the same time, like, building that ethos, the culture that you want, is as important as the technology, the product, the market, and ultimately, like, some of the challenges that we had were not having an alignment at Hyperloop. We're not having an alignment at the top about what we wanted the culture of the organization to be, right? Is this a technology development company? Is it a company that's going out to do something really hard, really challenging? Or is it like a services company? And, like, you see a wide range of people, and because you didn't explicitly say what that was, people formed their own opinions about it and then acted accordingly.
Yeah, and, like, we're huge fans of, we obviously, when we are going out and trying to find the right person for a role, we want to advertise the role to them, right? We want to highlight how amazing these companies are, and we truly believe that, because we only partner with companies we think are truly amazing, how cool the team is, etc. Right? We want to highlight the good parts. We also want to be really direct about what might be tough about it. And what the person needs to look out for, because we really believe that people will screen themselves out if they're not a good fit. But if you've got founders that maybe have conflicting ideas about what that culture is, or they just haven't defined that, and you might end up either not screening out the wrong people or screening out two different groups of people. Which is not what we're targeting.
And the way I think I've got a better mental model for it now is, like, imagine, like, my wife and I just bought a house, right? You guys bought a house or moved into new places or whatever it might be. And imagine someone describing that house to you, and you're going to make a decision whether or not to buy it without ever seeing it or walking in it, right? So how good of a job you can explaining it, talking about the upside, but also knowing that, hey, the roof leaks, right? Like probably want to know that. You're going to move into the house. And I think, like, trying to keep that in mind for employees is, like, you want to, it's about evaluating them, but it's also about, like, why they are going to help maybe fix the roof, or why they're going to do this, or why they're going to do that. That, like, hey, it's not perfect, right? And the reason you're coming in is not only for your technical skills, especially at the beginning, not only for your technical skills, but, like, your willingness to want to dig in, find the right solutions for, the culture of the company. And, every now and then you're going to go the wrong way, and you need to, like, come back in. But I think having people willing to do that and, like, own it was something I don't think we spent as much time as we should have at Hyperloop at the beginning. And then we had to play catch up, and it's really hard to play catch up in that space. In terms, you've built teams and are currently building teams. What is some of your strategy for building those teams? So both in hiring and in kind of building team cohesion and inspiring the team. There are my two favorite questions I like to ask in an interview. I think they show two different things. So the one I try to do in a variety of ways, either the first conversation and then usually we'll do some kind of presentation, is tell me something that either the thing you're most proud of working on, or the thing you're most excited about talking about, right? Because they get to pick whatever it is. It could be work, it could be some personal passion, whatever. And if that person isn't excited about that, like I literally gave them the prompt of like, tell me about the thing you're most excited about working on. And if you can't get jazzed about that, then like, how are you going to get jazzed about some of the other stuff I have to ask you to do? As any of us have things that we're really excited about our job, and then other things are like, ugh.
That's
right?
so good. Yeah.
And then you get to learn a lot about a candidate. You get to see what makes them tick. You get to see how they describe that problem in the sense of like what makes them excited about it, right? And I think that's really interesting. And the second one, I think reveals a lot about a person's character, which is recall throughout your whole career who would be your toughest critic, right? And I try to pause them for a second. I'm like, recall that person to mind. And I give them a moment or two, right, to make them really think about it. And I said, if I called that person up right now, what would they tell me about you? Right? Because you get a variety of responses, and you get those people who give you the bullshit strength as a weakness.
Yeah.
And I'm like, listen, that's not what I want.
Yeah.
Right? Like, tell me really, right? So then you get a wide range of like, in some cases you go the far extreme, like self-deprecation. You get these other areas that are like really reflective, and you see people really like trying to access who that might be. And then I'll ask them like, why that situation? And then the final follow-up to that is like, what did you learn or what did you change about the way you operated from that situation? And I think a lot of those are really interesting to see. I mean, I actually cared not that much about the answer. I care about people's thoughtfulness and their ability to like want to be better, and their ability to be honest and transparent, because like at some point they're going to make a mistake, just like I make mistakes. Are they going to be willing to tell me that they made that mistake? Are they going to be willing to like bring that up and in a way that's actually helpful and candid to the organization? Because this is just an interview, right? Like, let's keep it real. Like, let's see what there is. And so those are two my favorite ones. And then, I think Elon has a strategy he's probably talked about quite a bit, which is like when someone gives you like something technical, really dive in there. Like, what was their role in it? What was their responsibility? If they eventually, like the people who didn't do it and are taking credit for others' work, it'll break at some point in that level. And so like I view it as like on a 1 to 5 scale, like 5 being the most difficult technical question I could possibly think of, and 1 being, like a softball. I usually start with a 2 or 3, see how they do. And then usually I'll go to a 4. And if they do that really well, I don't need to go to a 5, right? Like I feel like these people or this person is actually a good candidate for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. That question is an excellent one for someone who is skilled at interviewing or good at reading people and can like go with them. I've heard some people use a question like that and then take the weakness and go, well, if they've had a problem like that, then it's a no. And we go, okay, let's work through it, because the way that you explained that question, right? You go, tell me the scenario.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, why was that? Right? Help back it out so you get the full context. And if someone is being honest and transparent about what might have been a really tough situation for them, right? You're able to get the full picture and really understand someone who's going to go, this is just an interview. I'm going to like open it up and let's go there, right?
Yeah.
Which it can be such a valuable way to see the inner workings of someone. And it can also be tough if people go, oh, gotcha.
Yeah. And I think to your point, like if someone asks me that question, I'm like, geez, where do I start?
You're right.
But like at the other hand is there's a degree of self-realization and self-confidence that comes with that too, right? And like the people you're looking for in companies, you want them to be self-motivated, self-starters and everything like that. And if they're willing to kind of confront those demons, then like, all right, they're going to be reasonably motivated to, like I was saying, like, I made a lot of mistakes at Hyperloop. I made a lot of mistakes throughout my career. And the thought is like, you could be almost paralyzed by that. And for a little bit, I was paralyzed by the thought of like, boy, I don't want to repeat these mistakes. And then I actually started to think about it a different way. It's like, no, this is just an opportunity to make new mistakes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
And they don't have to be the same ones because I've already made those ones. So you can check those off. And now I can just get on to the next level of mistakes that I'm going to make.
And I mean, and it's part of what makes you and seasoned mistake makers like
Yeah.
me, right? Like if we hide from those or are embarrassed or we don't consume them and go, okay, yep, this is part of it and I can learn from it, then we are liable to make those mistakes again, right? But if we can look them in the face, like you said, confront those demons and learn from it, you become really valuable to organizations who are likely about to traipse through, that part of the journey again.
And I think when you look at a startup, if they see, my opinion is, if they see a leader make a mistake and they see that leader own up to the mistake, call it out, and basically say, like, this won't be the last one I make.
Yeah.
Let's be clear, this is not going to be the last one I make. It also gives, I think, a degree of like, okay, he's learning, I'm learning, and
this is the culture.
This is the culture that we're doing it. And we did one of the really cool things we did at Hyperloop. We went from basically like nothing to a big test in about 18 months, from a garage to this test. Then we, in a year after that, we essentially built a whole 500-meter tube in the desert, a whole vehicle, a whole propulsion system, whole control system, like the whole thing in about a year. And afterwards, we did this kind of recognition where we basically, a lot of people who went above and beyond, we brought them up, talked, and I gave a little spiel about like what I saw them do personally and what I've heard others say about them in this process, and kind of give that recognition. But the other thing we did 3 fail awards.
Nice.
And they each got these like little medals, and then every group, I had some actual piece of broken hardware or something like that mounted on a board that was like sitting around their area with some like cheesy thing I wrote on the back about like why this happened. And I remember like they were called the Ass Pucker Awards, right? Because you were like, right? And like one of them was like the whole vehicle was backing up and we lost comms and the vehicle kept moving.
No.
And it was like there was only like these little like wheel chocks at the end before this whole thing was going to crane off the end. And we're all watching this video with like everybody's hitting every e-stop and nothing's happening. And you watch it roll up these chocks and it goes straight up the wheel. And it like teeters for like the longest quarter second of your life, and then it rolls back down in the pod, and we're like, oh, thank God, right? So they ended up getting the number 1 Pucker Award. Actually, sorry, they got the number 2. The other one was this one where there's a piece of physics that we thought were secondary effects, and when secondary effects become primary, they have a way of really disrupting tests. And so the whole back end of the vehicle basically lifted about 3 feet off the track and came slamming down. And it was a Saturday. We were going like 20 miles an hour faster every day at the test. And at that point, it was like 11 p.m. I was like, well, maybe we should just shut it down and figure out what happened here. But like those, I think, were like really good because it gave people the idea of, getting excited about that. And the thing I kind of regret a little bit is we got away from that as we got bigger with Hyperloop, and we kind of lost some of that. And looking at what's next, like trying to keep that excitement, because I thought that was something that really brought the team together. And I don't think we did enough of that later.
Yeah.
In the book Radical Candor, they talk about making mistakes known and having that type of culture, exactly like you're talking about. And she even suggested having in your meetings essentially exactly this: awards for who made the worst mistake that week. And it encouraged people to be open and vocal with those mistakes, and the whole team got to learn about them and not make the same mistakes. And I feel like it was such a great idea. And you also don't want to minimize the impact of them and laugh them off, but you want to say, hey, this, like, we're all making these mistakes. Let's learn from them.
Yeah. And I think like when you look back, kind of like growing up, like some of the best like hockey coaches I ever had were the ones that would like, you would just get done getting like shellacked in a game, right? Like you would just get, this was one of the worst games. And the guy said, well, we weren't going to win them all, right?
Yeah.
And then just like leave it and move on type of deal. And I thought like that like team sport aspect of growing up was something that was phenomenally important. Like with our little 4-year-old now, like how is he going to get that same type of experience, right? Like, is it a team sport? Is it something else where you can really have to put personal ambition and ego aside to get to something better for the whole, which I think is a really bizarre thing to actually want to do, right?
Yeah.
Like to work for somebody else or work for each other as opposed to necessarily yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get one last leader, like personal type question, and then we'll dive into some of the technical stuff. But so you are a super high performer. You do a lot for a lot of people. Are there any practices that you have to keep your health and your energy at that high performing state?
Great question. I really don't do caffeine. It's like my wife's biggest, like, she's like, how are you just like this all the time? And like little sleep. I think just some people are built certain ways, but I will say what really affected my management style was COVID.
Okay.
We ended up having to go remote. My management style was not, and even to this day, isn't particularly conducive to a remote type of setting. And you kind of lost that immediate connection with people. You lost a lot of other things, but you did gain the opportunity to actually be and have a lot more focused work. So
Yep.
I've actually started to dislike the concept of open offices.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things I like. I like the serendipity of walking past somebody. Some of the greatest work I've ever done is because of an open office. But on the other hand, it's really hard to focus. Like if I need 2 hours to work on something. So as I go forward on that side, but I realized towards the end of my time at Hyperloop that I was not, like weeks would go by, I wasn't accomplishing what I wanted to accomplish. I wasn't being particularly effective in the areas I wanted to be. And once kind of moved on, I spent about 2 months just like, how am I going to work differently going forward? Because, you know, it was not easy on our marriage. It was not easy on a lot of different things. And it also just like, it wasn't fun, right? And one of the advisors to Hyperloop, a good friend of mine, Peter Diamandis, he has a number of books that he does. He does this one book, series of books with a guy named Steven Kotler. And Steven did this book called Art of the Impossible. It's not all that old. It's maybe like 2 or 3 years old. And it was the first one of these books that I actually read that had tactics and methods.
Cool.
Because so many of these things, like they talk about like this kind of high level, whatever it is, that you're like, I can't really put that into practice, right? So you went through this kind of course. I highly recommend it. Basically, it's like, how do you create like exponential growth, right? There's this concept to do something 5% better each week. But what does that really mean? Like that's a hard thing to do. So for me, it's like, I love working out in the mornings. That gets my brain in a certain state. I love doing it in the mornings because I get the benefit of it all day. But when you look at like exercise, you look at basically, how do you do that, right? You ramp and then you have a recovery week. You ramp, you have a recovery week. And over time, you build that fitness up. With what Steven, his biggest thing that I really took is actually 2 things. One was at the beginning of each week, you look at your long-term goals. What is the one thing that you can do that week to make every subsequent week easier?
Yeah.
Right? He calls it an unlocking move. And I've never thought about it in that case. So each week now I'm trying to say like, what's the one thing I can do that will make every subsequent week easier, right? And maybe that's hire somebody, right? To offload this piece of whatever I'm doing. Maybe it's get a tool. Maybe it's spend a little bit on some automation or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And the second piece was this concept of, you know, like you probably did this professor thing where he took a jar and he filled it with big rocks. During college, he said, is this jar full? And you're like, yeah, it's full. And then he put in little rocks. He goes, is it full now? And then he put in like smaller rocks and he put in sand, right? So the goal is like, what do you need to accomplish that week? Pencil out, actually block it out in your calendars, the things that you want to do, and then do them.
Yeah.
Like no excuses. Like this is what you want to do each day. And so on Sunday nights, I'll kind of plan out the big things I want to do. I need to keep some flexibility in, but like here's dedicated 2-hour blocks where cell phones off, emails off. I'm not communicating with anybody. I'm just working through the things I need to work through. And then with that in mind, like at the end of each day, you feel like you actually accomplished. The same way when you work out in the morning, it's like, I did something today. Right? It's like, oh, I set out to do these things and I accomplished them. And just like with the communicating, I was abysmal. The first 2 months, I was like, I can't finish anything. It's just like, man. And then I like reset, kind of rescoped. I also realized how unproductive tools like WhatsApp, Slack, all of these things can be from a focus standpoint, and how you have to kind of get through this initial frustration and focus. And it's so easy to pick up a phone or do an email when it's actually like a very unvaluable thing to the overall business that you're trying to do.
Yeah, that's Awesome. That was gold right there.
Yeah.
So
like
good.
like identifying what you need to do and then doing it.
Yeah.
I would say like we should probably just name that's probably the name of the
this is a big
podcast.
one, yeah.
Actually do
Yeah.
the things.
Do
Okay.
actually
do it. Like,
Noted.
oh yeah, who would have
Noted.
thought? What a novel concept, right?
I do know I follow a really similar thing where, prioritize, put your boulders in, or big
Yeah.
rocks, little rocks. And man, do I get a hit of dopamine when I cross
yeah.
those things off my list.
Yeah.
So it, after you do it for a little while, the habit, starts to
Yeah.
build the rewiring in your brain where you get that positive reward for doing the thing.
And you just don't realize how much until you actually called attention to your habits. Like as soon as something would get a little bit hard, as soon as you get a little bit of that friction, you'd immediately want some relief, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you can pop that up with your phone, with an email, and feel like you did something. And then you just restart that cycle each and every time, and you actually make no progress.
Yep. Get through the friction pieces first, and leave yourself the quick hitters after. That's really good. Awesome. I have so many more questions for you, but I want to be respectful of
show in
time.
the future.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll move on to kind of discussing the technical topic that we have at hand, which is what is the future of sustainability and how does NewSpace fit in, if at all?
Yeah. So I guess part of where this topic came up is that I think our interests and your interests, there's these two different domains and they may or may not intersect.
Mm-hmm.
We're both very interested in space, new space, defense type work, and then also clean tech, sustainability. So that's what we want to explore here is how they fit in. So like, for example, space gets a pretty bad rap from a lot of environmentalists. There's rocket exhaust, rocket waste, space junk. What's your perspective on these issues? Are they fair criticisms or are they very small? And what do you think?
I mean, I think at a high level, progress does require the expenditure of like effort and in some cases like things, right? And if you look at something like a Falcon 9, I think like a first stage of Falcon 9 has maybe 25,000 gallons of kerosene on it, give or take, right? 25,000 gallons of kerosene. You get like 4 miles to a gallon in a truck. That's only 100,000 miles, right? That's across the country 30 times, right?
Yeah.
Like SpaceX did the most launches ever this year, and I think they did like 55, right? Or something, 50 or 60 or something like that.
Trying to get 100 this year.
Yeah, and you think like, okay, so that's 30 cross-country trips per flight, right? Yeah, now you've got all of the infrastructure, all of the build-up, all that other stuff, but like, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big, right? I do think when you look at what's going on with Starship and the views of just fuels in general, like I did a lot of work around sustainable transportation, right? And like battery electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, aircraft, right? I think battery electric vehicles are here to stay. I think they're a good thing for like passenger cars. I think they're the right thing. I think as you get to larger vehicles like trucks, you're going to find some opportunities, I think, for batteries there. But if we can really, in my opinion, this goes for flight, I don't think there's ever going to be a hydrogen aircraft. I think it's going to be, like, think about how long it's taken us to get to the safety level that aircrafts are today, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now you're going to completely replace that with high-pressure hydrogen tanks inside of a new structural design. Like, if our grandkids even have a hydrogen aircraft like ready to go, like I think like that'll be a testament. I think the better way to go about this is like, don't upset the infrastructure here, right? Like there's already an infrastructure for basically fuels, like hydrocarbon based fuels. Let's just make them sustainably, right? And so when you look at what SpaceX is doing with Starship going after methane, like, I think that's the right call, right? You can use methane. Those can come from cows. They can come from decomposition of waste, a bunch of other things like that. Yeah. Not to mention, you can make that in a variety of other areas in there. So I think like...
And its exhaust is much cleaner too,
Its exhaust is much cleaner. So I think like they're taking the step in the right direction. I think they're taking a practical step as opposed to going after like a hydrogen rocket, right? Which, sure, you can do. We know there are plenty of people doing it. But at the same time, you have to have the cryo. You have to have the leak. Like, look at how difficult... what SLS was doing with their vehicle, right? All of the leaks that they were having and like largely speaking, spending maybe 10x the amount of dollars and maybe 5 times the amount of time compared to what a Starship can. So I think they're going the right after with methane. And I think the way to do these and like what spirit of like and good engineering is like let people do what they want to do naturally, but just don't destroy the world around us with it, right? And so if we can find a way to generate without having to create brand new infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is expensive. The infrastructure of solar and hydrogen is like needed, but like at some point, should we actually do it? Like I see a lot of things. One of the little pet peeves of mine is this idea of green hydrogen, right? And green hydrogen in spirit is a good idea. In practice, it's something different, right? So green hydrogen is the thought of you basically take water, you add renewables, you make hydrogen out of that. To split apart a water molecule is 7 times more energy than to split apart the hydrogen from basically methane.
Wow.
We already don't have enough solar. We already don't have enough renewables. So why would I take the limited things I have now, make through a bunch of inefficient steps, make something that's really less efficient? Why don't I just take the solar and the wind and all that other stuff and just plug it into the grid? Right. And worse, like if they actually take these hydrogen fuels or electrolyzers now, plug them into the grid, and then charge a hydrogen car with it, it will be twice as bad as burning diesel.
Wow.
From the normal like hydrocarbon footprint of the grid, right? So like when you look at the ways to go, I think we need to be moving in this direction, but like each dollar that we're spending should be a dollar well spent. And I think if we can go after from a converting agricultural sources or waste sources into hydrocarbon fuels, that's going to be something that doesn't require the whole world to have to be upset around it. Yeah. We can get the cost to a good point. And then I think lastly, like it completely changes the game with energy infrastructure. Right now, like wealthy countries and poor countries are differentiated by the access to energy. Right? Like that is the number one thing that's between the two. Like every country has trees that fall down. Not that need to be cut down, that fall down, right? Every country has some degree of waste, right? Like if we can talk about reutilizing that or utilizing that to build say a resilient point or a re-onshoring, like no matter how you view it, it's like to become self-sufficient and self-supplied, like that's a win for everybody. It's a win for like local industry. It's a win for not having to rely on foreign sources, whatever it might be. And I think that's the way that we need to go. So when you look at places like like SpaceX or others, I think going after methane or similar things to that are going to be the way that they can be sustainable long term. Because as soon as SpaceX says, "Hey, this rocket was just powered by cow farts," right? Like, what are they going to have left to complain about? Now we got access to a completely new thing. Like, there's not a lot else to complain about.
So, we were talking earlier about how there's so much passion overlap in between space and between clean tech. And so if someone frankly wants to work on both, what are some of the better ideas you've heard out there or interests of how we can leverage tech in space or tech from the space industry to help our planet?
I think I was really unaware of maybe the lack of infrastructure that truly does exist in space. Right. And it's not even like, like the colonies compared to the British Empire when they came over, right? It's more like, you went on a solo backpacking trip, right? And so
what is there besides some communications? Even that is not easy.
I spent a bit of time with a group called the Defense Innovation Unit. They have a couple of different sectors. They have a space sector headed up by a guy named Steve Batal. And Steve was telling me about what they are trying to build in space from an internet perspective, right? There's all of these LEO constellations coming out. The next big thing is going to be on the geo side of the fence, right? Who's building what, where, to get high data rates? Like right now, data is extremely slow. It's kind of like going to my father-in-law's house out in the woods and watching the pixels load single thing by single line, and could you imagine trying to operate an autonomous system on the moon?
Right.
With dial-up. Wow. Right? Like in a way, it's autonomous, but like you still need better access. Like you wouldn't imagine a car driving around the streets of San Francisco, with a guy on a cell phone basically saying it's making a left now, like it's so I think like you have to build that infrastructure out. I think access to orbit is going to be really important, both time and cost. Obviously, there's SpaceX, there's a number of other players going to there. Particularly interested, I think Relativity will launch relatively soon, and I'm curious about that idea. It's an interesting idea. Like, my initial reaction to it was like, sounds like an expensive way to make a rocket, but
Yeah.
they've done, I think, some pretty interesting stuff around that. I'm really curious to see where all these smaller companies go, if there'll be a consolidation in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
But in a way, it's actually a little bit refreshing to see, a little bit odd to say, but a little bit refreshing to see maybe a couple of struggles, is that like launching stuff into space is still hard.
It's still really hard.
You know, like it's, everything still wants to fall down.
Yep.
You know, like that still is the same 20 years on from SpaceX. And
a
so
lot has to go right in a rocket launch.
A lot has to go right.
And nothing can go wrong. I think that's like the phrase, right?
And I think like when you look at the opportunities here, the one that I go back and forth on is really the idea of like a huge in-space manufacturing idea. Like, I could see the implications of it, or in the size of it. And there's certain things that make sense, right? Like, if a part on your spacecraft breaks, you don't want to have to like go all the way down to like the Home Depot and pick something up and come back. Like, you want to 3D print it there and fix it. The part that I want to see is like, where did the benefits come from zero G, right? Like, where does that in the manufacturing space really come from? Because we could assume that the cost will come down, not quite to shipping across the country.
Yeah.
But I think they'll be good there. But I just don't know enough about like, what is the art of the possible and like zero G manufacturing, and maybe it's pharmaceuticals or, you know, fiber optic cables or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So
have you seen or heard of any ideas for how we can save Earth, but from space? Like, or ways that we can impact our climate and sustainability on Earth, but through the space industry?
I really think the kind of the ubiquitous of sensor technology is fairly interesting, whether it's, you know, as simple as like Skybox and looking at, like, look what's doing in like the conflict with Ukraine, right? And you can see the benefits of that. You can also see, I think, maybe a little bit more socially, politically, the access to the right amount of information without like country firewalls, right? Whether it's what's going on in Iran, or you look at what might be going on in China or Russia or something like that, like, oh, you can get access to, I'll say, quote unquote, the truth. Now, I think the truth is also in dispute these days, especially like the thought of like Chat GPT, which is a phenomenal tool, but now you have the ability to create not necessarily like malicious, but just inaccurate information, which is going to be really challenging. So I think there's that. I think data, access to data, thing that stuck with me profoundly is in the rural parts of like Sri Lanka. There's used to be like a guy who like knew how to fix all like mopeds and equipment. I was there a couple years ago. Now I just saw like a bunch of teenagers with an iPhone and YouTube.
Wow.
Like, think about now all of a sudden this democratization of information. Like, I think there's a huge push there, and I think we're just starting to tap the idea of what a Starlink can do. Right? This idea to like, what information or what infrastructure can you build when you all of a sudden have this type of access to info? And that, I think, is probably the most fascinating thing, is like, in the same way that the iPhone spawned a whole course of like Uber, Airbnb, like all these companies that like relied on that, but they needed the infrastructure of an iPhone. I think Starlink is going to be that for this kind of next generation there. And that's what I think is really exciting. So if you build cool stuff off of the Starlink platform or that idea of this, I think you're going to be well ahead of the market curves going forward.
Wow. That's really cool.
So cool. So cool. So creating a company that is sustainable is not necessarily great for the business's bottom line just by itself. So how can founders make a strong business out of something that, like, out of an altruistic goal that they have?
I think it's about framing it. I think it's about framing it is that, like, the way I look at it at a personal level is, will my kid be proud of me in 20 years, right? And is he going to look back and say, like, why did you make this decision? Or why did you work on this versus that? You could have worked on anything. Why did you pick these things? At the end of the day, like, altruism and economic are different only in the present, at the end, we both want to live long and prosper, right? Like, that's like essentially what we want to do. So like, it's like a time question, right?
Yeah.
So like, how do you basically align the time thing? Is that like, if we do what's right, then we'll be better off for it. We just might have to take a little bit of a penalty now. And one of the fascinating things I heard from someone who pitches sustainable projects to the government, they have the same pitch for Democrats. They have the same pitch for Republicans. They change one word.
Wow.
There's resiliency from like ESG, right? So this idea of like, we want to create and like self-sustaining solutions because they don't pollute the environment. They don't do all these things. You say like, well, we want to protect the environment. We want to go after these environmental sustainable goals and do this. And like people who might deny climate change, like, you know, whatever, that's going to be their view to do. Then just say like, well, don't you want to be self-sufficient?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, isn't this a way that we can be self-sufficient if we don't have to rely on these other things? We could build self-reliance. We can build domestic capabilities. We can build jobs. We can build manufacturing and do all these things. Like we can get to the right solution. It's just about how you frame it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think if we spent more time, like less time, like maybe like hollering about how bad the world's going to get and say like, hey, like if we do these things now, it's actually going to be better for all of us. Like more jobs, more of this, and it gets us to the right goal. Like imagine having U.S. domestic battery manufacturing, U.S. domestic solar production.
Yep.
Mhm.
Right. Like what's the downside?
Right.
Like, somebody tell me what the downside is.
Yeah.
And in that case, like you can get to the goals that you want to be, you can build businesses, you can build all of the things. And so I think you just have to frame it differently and say like, yeah, it's going to be a little bit more painful now, but like we all want after the same thing. And then you have a full kind of sustainable industry, which is what I would try to advocate in that space.
Yeah. Is there a framework or a process that a founder can go down to identify those markets or ways that they can make their products or their business model so that it is both sustainable or altruistic, but also, you know, thrives in our capitalist environment?
Yeah. I usually go down like these techno-economic type of models. And I do two things with them. Like one is there's the same, you know, call it amortized cost. So if it's electricity, it's like $1 per kilowatt hour. If it's hydrogen production, it's $1 per kilogram of hydrogen, right? And you get a cost of what that looks like, right? And then there's the same analysis you can do. You just change the unit of measurement, which is like, you know, either $1 per kilogram or ton of CO2 emitted or a ton of CO2 per hydrogen emitted or whatever it might be. And I think each one of those, especially right now with the Inflation Reduction Act, if you start to factor in some of these tax credits for building things and capital equipment, you could actually make a really good business in the next 3 to 5 years off of these credits. And if you think about what does that mean, like a credit, like, oh, it has a bad thing. But imagine if I built a system that had almost no OpEx, right? So what has no OpEx? Well, solar has no OpEx or very little OpEx because I get the sun for free. Yeah. I can get all of my infrastructure potentially paid for from this, right? So now all of a sudden I have the right solution. I've just gotten a subsidy or a payment to build it.
Yeah.
So in this case, like if you can frame your model that's like almost more CapEx today, less operational cost tomorrow, then someone's going to be like, yeah, like the return on this project is like 20 or 30% year over year because it has almost no operational cost. And so I think when you look at how much, you know, the trade is always like, how much do I spend today versus how much do I spend tomorrow? Today, I would say, like, look at the Inflation Reduction Act. Look at the tax credits that come from these things. And a lot of them are direct payments, right, for each kilogram of hydrogen produced or whatever. Set your system up so that the future one essentially has no operating cost.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to rely on these credits in the future.
Exactly.
You take advantage while they're there.
Yep.
And then you have a sustainable
Yeah.
business.
And I think when you look at like telecom and a bunch of these other ones, they followed similar types of models before. And so the time is kind of nigh for that, right? Like in the next 3 to 5 years, you'll have access to these. Like, let's build.
So cool.
Yeah. I'm really glad we're going down this path because one of the things that we've been so impressed by you and like getting outside of this show, just getting to like hear how your mind works is there are a lot of people with altruistic ideas, but we have to look at how it's going to interact with the market, how energy is already flowing to those ideas or not. As you've mentioned during this conversation here, like, what can we already capture that's going to make this easy, and we're not creating more trouble for ourselves just to have this great altruistic outcome, right? Like, we can't, like, shame is not a good motivator to get people to use your business, right? So it's really cool to hear how you look from all of these different perspectives to see not only how do we have really strong outcomes for a business, but how do we have it work realistically in the market that we have that exists and with the materials and resources that are already available. It's really cool.
Yeah, and I think, like, your point, I think Seyka is spot on, is like, shame will only get you to do enough work so that you don't get shamed again.
Right.
It's not going to get you to do the right thing.
Right.
But it's just like, God, I don't want to hear this person complain to me anymore.
Right.
Like,
right.
Right. And so it's like, that's not, really like teaching somebody to fish. It's kind of just like, please, like, I'll do the bare minimum to do that. So agreed.
Yeah. That's fabulous. Well, Brian and I are lucky enough to have some really cool insights into some of the things that you're doing right now and that you're working on. But what can you share publicly with us about what you're working on now?
So there's a lot of really exciting things. I think leaving Hyperloop, there was this, like, will Hyperloop be the greatest thing I ever did? This like trepidation about the future. And the cool thing is, for the last 7 years I was doing stuff there, like, guess what? The world was moving on, and there was some, like, really rad stuff happening. And it's like, you kind of, like, felt like you were working on something good. Maybe it didn't turn out the way that you wanted, but, like, you looked up and, like, there's other people working on some cool stuff and some cool ideas. So for me, there's a couple that are really coming to mind. One is around agricultural waste, right? There's huge amounts of naturally occurring agricultural waste, and these are there's not cutting down trees, but just trees that fall down, branches that fall down, leaves, corn stalks, you name it, right? There's huge amounts of this. So much of this around the world right now is basically just burned in open air, right? And you think about that, there's a reason they burn it. They don't have all this space. They can't really compost it. But that's a bunch of energy that's just being lost, right?
Yeah.
How can we harness that either to make biofuels, to make energy, to make heat, to make this, to make that? And one of the things that was really exciting to me is, if you think about the problem with CO2, at the end of the day, the problem is not how to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Like, we know how to do that. There are things that do that.
Yeah.
The problem is an economics problem, right?
Yep.
And so how do you get people to want to do the right thing? Well, you give them an economic reason to do it.
Yep.
And so the initial thought process was like, all right, what's the most valuable material that we can make that's kind of a carbon-based material? And right now, one of those materials is called graphene. And so the thought was like, can we create graphene or a graphene-like material, which is one of the strongest known materials, but right now it's primarily produced from graphite, which is a mine source, limited quantities, limited supplies where it can come from. How can we take something that's agricultural waste and make a valuable material after it? So basically, you start with agricultural waste, you essentially pyrolyze that, or really pyrolyze is a similar to combustion, just without oxygen or very low oxygen. That creates char. So if you ever taken a log out of a fire too early, it basically has these little, like, pieces of char in it. That's mainly carbon, right?
Yep.
And that carbon used to be in the air because it came in through a tree, which used photosynthesis, and ended up being able to create this log, right, from it, or plant, or whatever it might be. And so, we can look at direct air carbon capture. We can look at all these things that are expensive, and what we have lots of, trees. Trees are great.
Yeah.
I love trees for a bunch of reasons, but this is even like another reason to love trees.
Yeah.
And in this case, like, we want to build a valuable material out of that and do that in a way that's like, hey, hypothetically, could we make all the anodes for batteries that are typically made out of graphite that is mined? Could you make those from a agricultural source domestically?
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Could you do that, right? And what are some of the other ways that you could make mining the air economically viable? There's a company called 12, which is trying to do something similar, trying to take CO2 out of the air, kind of regardless how you take it out. They're just like, here's a better thing that you can make from it. And here's a way to I'll say return a profit on that, right? And so how can you get people to start to do these right things because you can sell something of value for it? And I think that's what we're trying to do. It's a material science question. I will say the only class I got an A- in college was material science.
And here you are.
So here we are. So that's why we need help, right?
Yeah,
And we're trying to recruit because an engineer can only do so much. And but I think the concept is the right concept, right? And how do you take that the spirit of like to get people to do the right thing? Just give them the right economic incentive.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we can get there. And then all of a sudden, right now, CO2 is a waste product. And it's non-valuable. You have to pay to deal with it. All right, what if you actually just made it slightly valuable? It doesn't need to be like gold or platinum or anything like that. Just like, I don't know, maybe like a cent or something like that. It's better than zero or negative.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, if you're able to do that, then I think you start to see shifts move in that, right? So that's one. There's a couple of other little entities been helping out. One that's new, is still pretty in stealth mode, that's using Starlink in a very, very interesting way. And it also has a sustainability bend to it. And we see, data consumption and data processing being a substantial growth area, which is great from a revenue standpoint, but it's also going to be a substantial increase in energy consumption around the world. So how do you make sure that as you move forward with these crazy AI models that need a lot of compute and all these things, how are you able to effectively get them to an area where people want to be and are able to do that sustainably? So there's some interesting stuff there. And then lastly, on the defense side of the fence, and the thing that really became apparent to me is, and coming back to that conversation with my little guy, like Lucas, he's 4 now. So let's say in 2040, when he'll be 22, then he's gonna be like, Dad, like, bro, I gotta tell you, you had a chance to do something and you were just like chilling, right? Like what was going on? And so there's two things. One, this climate side of the fence. So helping companies like be able to get through some of the mistakes that I made, right? Get over those hurdles, do it faster, do it more effectively so that we can get more of these solutions. Like I want to see these companies with good ideas, get them into the world as quickly as possible. Even if I'm not directly responsible for it, if I can help, like that's a win. And the second piece is I feel like our way of life is a bit under attack. And by that, I mean like the fact that we've been able to live the last like 30 years with kind of US preeminence and dominance around the world, we get to project our ideals. And we're seeing other people that don't have those same ideals, whether it's Russia invading a sovereign country like Ukraine. You see kind of what's happening kind of once we gave up and relinquished what's going on in Afghanistan. You see, China becoming increasingly ambitious. And, that's a very dangerous combination of a high amount of technology, a surveillance state, an authoritarian government. Like there's a quick way that 1984 Orwellian future shows up, and it's actually there in a lot of different capacities today. Like, so how do we ensure that our kids get to enjoy what we need to do now? It's like, we need to, we don't need to be going and taking other people's things. That's not what I believe in, but we need to be ensuring that like us, our allies, are able to protect their ways of life. Because I do believe the way that we live, the freedoms that we have, the fact that you can go on the street and you can completely disagree with the government and you're not going to get thrown in jail. You're not going to do this. You can even believe crazy things like climate change doesn't exist. Like, I don't think that's helpful, but it's, we're in a place where you can believe that. And at the end of the day, like, that is really scary as a dad to think about, like a child not having that level of freedom, right? Or that level of something. And so the defense area, protecting kind of our troops, our assets, our allies, our ideas, and our ideals is something that really is, I didn't think was going to be so important to me until really probably like 2022 happened. And you realized, I think, even like domestically, like, I think we kind of take it for granted a little bit. So how can we, make sure we don't rot from within, but at the same time, like Rome fell at the edges before it fell in Rome itself. And I think like it starts inside. It starts from a bunch of things there, but like for us to be able to protect our ideals and our allies is going to be like a really big thing for this century in a way that it, quite frankly, hasn't been for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And if tech is going to be a huge part of that, AI is going to be a huge part of that. And like, let's make sure we're in the lead, because when you're in the lead, you can dictate like the way things are going to go. Because if you're in the back seat, you know, decisions are made for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
That's really cool. Any details
Anything we can expect to see there? On
Yeah,
that front
I think there'll be some. There'll probably be some news sooner rather than later on that regard. But I really think there's an opportunity to automate a lot of the ways that we do engineering. There's a lot of things that engineers do that are a waste of their skill sets, right? There's a lot of things that engineers are really good at. And like, we should find ways to let them do more of that, let that creative side come out. And so the goal here would be to think through and actually reimagine the way that we can solve problems by combining some of the amazing techniques, the amazing capabilities of artificial intelligence with the engineering process. And right now we see them kind of be a little bit decoupled. We are seeing some, like, you know, a ChatGPT can write code. Yeah. I haven't personally seen how good of code it is. I've heard it's been all right, but like at the end of the day, like, how many different things will it have to go through to design like an aircraft? Yeah. Right. How can we design something like an F-35 without it costing hundreds of billions of dollars? How can we design something that protects us for a fraction? And the other piece that we have right now is, you know, we're particularly, you know, a lot of the areas I'm focused in like the missile defense area. The analogy I've used for people is we're defending ourselves with gold bullets when our enemies are shooting lead at us. Yeah. And like, how do you make, in the same way we talk about sustainability being economically viable, defense has to be economically viable. Right. You spend $850 billion a year on defense. Like, are we getting $850 billion a year of value? Right. I think the answer is easily a no on that one. So like that's the area where it's like, how can we make the right solutions at the right cost so that we can have, you know, if you're like a dad and you can only, basically right now we're saying like, do you want to save your son or your daughter? Yeah. Right. Like, why should we have to make that choice? It's like, let's just save both, but do it at the same price. Yeah. Yeah. So cool.
Excellent.
So cool.
Excellent.
Very excited to hear what other news comes out about that soon. Thank you so much for being on our show. I feel like we could talk forever about so many different ideas. You're such a pleasure to get to connect with, and you have so much wisdom to share. So truly, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, really
Brian,
appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
Having you here and sharing with our audience. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome.
Yeah. To the listeners, thank you for listening to AdAstra With. You can hear where you hear directly from the impactful leaders in aerospace and clean tech, sharing their behind-the-scenes knowledge from their industry experience, learn about the strategies that bring them success, and discuss controversial technical topics. Josh also mentioned a book a couple of times during this call. During this conversation, we'll make sure to add the title to our show notes so that you all are able to find that easily. It sounded like a really good Art of the Impossible. Yeah.
Transformative.
Very cool. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Great show.